Before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel and share this video with your friends. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Let's dive in. The snow crunched under the tires of the car as Emma pulled into the driveway of the cabin. It was the kind of winter night that seemed endless, with frost glistening on the trees and the sky a sheet of inky blackness. She stepped out, her breath clouding in the air, and looked up at the old structure. The cabin, nestled deep in the woods, looked exactly as she remembered it from their last trip years ago. Inside, laughter echoed through the wooden beams as her old friends, Claire, Jack, and Ryan, exchanged stories and sipped from steaming mugs. They hadn't all been together in years, but New Year's Eve had a way of pulling them back to each other. "Emma," Claire greeted her with a tight hug. "You made it." "Wouldn't miss it for the world," Emma said, shaking off the cold as she stepped inside. The warmth of the fire enveloped her, and she couldn't help but smile at the sight of her friends. It felt like old times. The night unfolded with chatter and nostalgia. They talked about their careers, relationships, and all the things they swore they'd achieve by now. The topic naturally turned to New Year's resolutions, a tradition they used to take seriously back in college. "Remember the list?" Jack asked, grinning. "We all wrote down our resolutions that one New Year's and buried them behind the cabin." "Of course," Ryan laughed. "What were we thinking? Like burying a piece of paper would make them come true." Claire chimed in. "I remember mine. I wanted to travel the world. Still working on it, though." Emma smiled but said nothing. The memory stirred something deep within her, an unease she couldn't place. "Emma, you were so serious about yours," Ryan said, turning to her. "What was it again?" Emma hesitated, her brows knitting together. She couldn't remember. The edges of the memory were blurry, like a dream fading upon waking. "I don't know," she admitted. I can't recall." "You were the one who insisted on the ritual," Jack teased. "You dragged us all out there with shovels." The group laughed, but Emma felt a chill run down her spine. She shook it off and changed the subject. The night grew colder as the fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the cabin walls. After hours of laughter and drinks, the group decided to revisit their old tradition. Fueled by nostalgia, Jack grabbed a flashlight, and Ryan unearthed an old, rusted shovel from the tool shed. "Let's dig up those resolutions," Jack said, his breath fogging in the icy air. "I want to see how far we've come, or how far we haven't." "Seriously?" Claire groaned, wrapping her scarf tighter around her neck. "It's freezing out here." "Come on, Claire," Ryan urged. "Don't ruin the fun." Emma trailed behind them, her boots crunching in the snow. Something about this felt wrong, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. She kept glancing over her shoulder, feeling as though they were being watched. The woods around the cabin were eerily silent, the kind of quiet that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. The group reached the spot near an old pine tree, now partially buried in snow. Jack began digging, and Ryan joined him, their laughter cutting through the stillness. "There it is!" Jack exclaimed, pulling out a small, weathered box. Its hinges were rusted, and the wood was splintered, but it had held up surprisingly well over the years. The group gathered around as Jack pried it open. Inside were 4 folded pieces of paper, slightly yellowed but intact. Each one had a name scrawled on the front in faded ink. "Mine first," Claire said, snatching hers and unfolding it. "Yep, travel the world. Still working on that?" Ryan laughed as he read his own. "Start a business." "Close enough, I guess." The startup didn't take off, but hey, I tried. Jack's resolution was predictable. "Find love." "Okay, don't judge me. I was 20 and dumb." They all laughed, but their attention turned to Emma when she reached for hers. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the paper. "What does it say?" Claire asked. Emma's brow furrowed. Her paper was blank. I don't remember this," she stammered. "There's nothing here." "Maybe the ink faded," Ryan suggested. "No," Emma said, her voice low. "I remember writing something. I just can't remember what." The group fell silent. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees. Jack broke the tension with a laugh. "All right, mystery woman. Guess we'll never know your big secret." As they turned to head back, Emma noticed something glinting in the snow where the box had been buried. She bent down and picked up a small, tarnished coin. It felt unnaturally cold in her hand, sending a jolt up her arm. "What's that?" Claire asked. "I don't know," Emma replied, staring at the coin. It was engraved with strange symbols she didn't recognize. An uneasy feeling crept over her, but she slipped it into her pocket without another word. The group returned to the warmth of the cabin, shaking off the chill and settling back into their comfortable banter. Yet, Emma couldn't shake the unease that had been building since they unearthed the box. The coin in her pocket seemed to burn against her leg, though when she touched it, it was as cold as ice. "All right, let's keep the party going," Jack said, popping another bottle of champagne. He poured everyone a glass and raised his in a toast. To old friends, new beginnings, and maybe some better resolutions this year. They clinked glasses, but Emma barely sipped hers. She couldn't stop staring out the window into the dark forest beyond. Shadows seemed to shift just beyond the tree line, though she couldn't tell if it was her imagination or the flicker of firelight playing tricks. "You okay, Emma?" Claire asked, her tone soft with concern. "Yeah, just tired," Emma replied, forcing a smile. "It's been a long day." As the hours passed and the clock inched toward midnight, the cabin grew quieter. Ryan dozed on the couch and Claire scrolled through her phone. Jack was in the kitchen, rummaging for snacks. Emma sat by the window, her unease growing with every passing moment. Then she saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the woods, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and thin, draped in what looked like a long coat. Its face was obscured, but Emma could feel its gaze, cold and piercing. She blinked, and it was gone. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "See what?" Claire asked, looking up. "Out there, by the woods. Someone was watching us." Claire frowned and joined Emma by the window. She peered out but saw nothing but snow and trees. "There's no one out there, Em. You're just spooking yourself." Emma nodded, though her gut told her otherwise. Minutes later, the cabin's power flickered and the lights went out completely. The sudden darkness drew startled gasps from everyone. "Jack!" Claire called. "What's going on?" Jack stumbled out of the kitchen with a flashlight, its beam cutting through the dark. "No idea, probably the generator. I'll check it out." "I'll come with you," Ryan said, grabbing his jacket. "No," Emma blurted, louder than she intended. "Don't go out there." Jack gave her a puzzled look. "It's probably nothing. The generator's just out back." "I don't think it's safe," she said, glancing nervously at the window. Claire placed a reassuring hand on Emma's shoulder. "We'll lock the door behind them. It's fine." Reluctantly, Emma let them go. She and Claire waited in tense silence as the minutes dragged on. The only sound was the wind howling outside. Then came the knock. It wasn't loud. Just 3 soft raps at the door. Claire froze, her eyes darting to Emma. "They're back already?" Emma shook her head, her heart pounding. She moved toward the door, her steps hesitant. "Jack? Ryan?" No answer. Another knock, this time harder. Emma grabbed the flashlight and peered through the peephole. The figure from the woods stood on the porch, its face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. It raised a hand, and something glinted in its grasp. The coin. Emma stumbled back from the door, her breath hitching. "It's him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Claire frowned. "Him who? What are you talking about?" "The man from the woods. He's here," Emma said, clutching the flashlight tightly. Her voice trembled as she pointed toward the door. "He has the coin." Claire hesitated, then walked cautiously to the door. She peered through the peephole, her hand resting on the deadbolt. "There's no one out there." "What?" Emma stepped forward and looked again. The porch was empty, snow swirling in the wind. She felt a chill crawl down her spine. The lights flickered back on, their sudden brightness making them both jump. The sound of footsteps and laughter came from the back of the cabin as Jack and Ryan returned, stomping snow off their boots. "Got it working," Jack announced, grinning. "Told you it was just the generator." "Did you see anyone outside?" Emma demanded, her voice sharp. Jack raised an eyebrow. "No, just some deer tracks." "Why?" Emma's stomach churned. "I saw someone at the door. He knocked." Ryan frowned. "You're sure it wasn't the wind? It's loud enough out there." "It wasn't the wind," Emma snapped, the fear in her voice silencing the room. Jack exchanged a glance with Claire. "All right, let's all calm down. We've had a long day. How about we just stay inside, finish our drinks, and wait for the countdown?" Reluctantly, Emma nodded, though her nerves remained frayed. She stayed near the fire, the warmth doing little to ease the icy dread that clung to her. As the minutes crept toward midnight, The group tried to regain their festive spirit, but Emma couldn't stop thinking about the man at the door. She slipped the coin from her pocket and examined it more closely. The strange symbols etched into its surface seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive. She couldn't read the markings, but they filled her with an overwhelming sense of dread. "What's that?" Ryan asked, leaning over to get a better look. "Just something I found in the snow," Emma said, her voice flat. She didn't want to explain, not yet. As the clock struck 11:59, the group gathered in front of the fireplace, counting down the final seconds of the year. Emma clutched the coin tightly, her heart racing. 10, 9, 8. A low, resonant knock echoed through the cabin, silencing the group. 7, 6. The knock came again, louder this time, as though it came from everywhere at once. 5, 4. The lights flickered, and the temperature in the cabin plummeted. Their breaths formed clouds in the frigid air. 3, 2. The door burst open, and the figure stepped inside. The firelight revealed its gaunt, pale face and hollow eyes that seemed to pierce straight through Emma. It raised a bony hand, pointing directly at her. The clock struck midnight, and the room plunged into darkness. The cabin was swallowed by darkness, save for the faint glow of the fire, now flickering weakly as though suffocated by the cold presence that filled the room. The figure stood motionless in the doorway, its shadow stretching unnaturally across the floor. Emma's breath hitched as the figure's hollow eyes locked onto hers. Its voice, deep and otherworldly, resonated through the cabin, shaking the very walls. "Emma," it said, dragging her name out like a hiss. "Do you remember the promise you made?" Her mind reeled. What promise?" she stammered, stepping back until she felt the rough wood of the mantel pressing into her spine. The figure tilted its head, its movement stiff and unnatural. "You sought a boon. You sought power. And in return, you promised me your soul, or another in your place." The group stared in stunned silence. Jack was the first to break it. "What the hell is this? Is this some kind of joke?" The figure turned its head toward him, the slightest motion freezing Jack in place. "You do not belong to this bargain," it said dismissively. "But you, Emma, your time is up." Emma's legs felt like lead as fragmented memories rushed back. She was 20, drunk on ambition and desperation. A bad breakup, academic failure, and the crushing weight of feeling like her life was slipping through her fingers. That New Year's Eve, she had stumbled into the woods, sobbing into the darkness, praying for a way to turn it all around. And then she saw him. Not as clear as now, but there. He had offered her the promise of success, whispered that her life could be everything she dreamed of, if only she agreed to the terms. Drunk and foolish, she accepted. Emma's voice shook. "I didn't mean it. I didn't know." "Intent is irrelevant," the figure interrupted. "A deal was struck, and now payment is due." Ryan stepped forward, his fists clenched. "I don't know what this is, but you're not taking her. Get out." The figure didn't move, but the air seemed to ripple. Ryan was thrown violently across the room, slamming into the wall. Claire screamed, rushing to his side as Jack grabbed the fire poker, brandishing it like a weapon. The figure's gaze shifted back to Emma. "Choose your soul or another." Emma froze, the weight of the ultimatum crushing her. "No," she whispered. "I can't." The figure took a slow step forward, its presence growing more oppressive with each movement. "If you do not choose, I will take them all." Jack swung the poker, but it passed through the figure as though it were made of smoke. He stumbled back, dropping the weapon. "Emma, what is this?" Claire cried, tears streaming down her face. "What did you do?" "I didn't know," Emma screamed, clutching her head. "I didn't think it was real." The figure extended its hand, the strange coin floating in midair. "The clock strikes, and the choice is yours." Emma's mind raced. If she sacrificed herself, it would end. But her life, her friends, everything she'd fought for would be gone. If she chose someone else, the thought was unbearable. The coin spun slowly in the air, waiting. The air in the cabin was suffocating as Emma stared at the spinning coin, her thoughts a chaotic storm. The figure loomed closer, its skeletal hand outstretched, waiting for her decision. Her friends watched in horror, frozen in place, as if they too were caught in some terrible spell. Jack broke the silence, his voice trembling with anger and fear. Emma, whatever this is, you can't give in to it. We'll figure something out. Don't listen to it. There is no escape, the figure intoned, its voice cold and absolute. The deal was sealed. The only question is who will pay. Emma's knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, tears streaming down her face. She thought about her life, everything she had achieved since that fateful night. Her career, her friendships, her sense of self-worth. All of it had been built on the foundation of a lie, a bargain she had long forgotten. And now the price had come due. I can't, she whispered, clutching her head. I can't let you take them. The figure leaned closer, its face inches from hers. The hollow eyes burned with a dim, spectral light. Then offer yourself. No, Claire shouted, pulling Emma back. There has to be another way. You don't have to do this. Emma looked into Claire's tear-filled eyes, her heart breaking. She couldn't sacrifice any of them. But as she stared into the darkness of the figure's gaze, an idea began to form. A dangerous, desperate idea. What if I made a new deal? Emma asked, her voice shaking but resolute. The figure paused, its head tilting slightly. What could you possibly offer that outweighs your own soul? Emma swallowed hard. Time. Give me time to repay the debt. I'll give you something greater. The figure's skeletal grin widened, its teeth gleaming like shards of bone. Time is not yours to bargain with, but I will grant this. 1 year. If, by the next midnight, you bring me another soul, I will release your friends. Her stomach turned. The weight of the offer was suffocating. Could she live with herself knowing she would condemn another to this fate? She looked at her friends, their fear and desperation written across their faces. 1 year, Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. And you'll leave them alone? The figure straightened, its hollow eyes glowing brighter. Swear it. Speak the oath. Emma clenched her fists, the coin burning cold against her palm. I swear. 1 year. I'll bring you another soul. The figure stepped back, its form beginning to dissolve into smoke. So be it. The clock is reset, but it ticks for you now. The temperature in the room began to rise, the oppressive cold fading as the figure vanished completely. The fire roared back to life, casting flickering light on the faces of her friends. They stared at her, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and betrayal. Emma, Claire said, her voice cracking. What did you just do? Emma couldn't meet their eyes. I bought us time, she whispered, but now I have to figure out how to fix this. The cabin was eerily silent except for the crackle of the fire. Emma's friends stared at her, their expressions a mixture of confusion, fear, and anger. She felt the weight of their gazes, but she couldn't bring herself to look at any of them. Her mind was consumed by the promise she had just made, a promise that could doom her or someone else. Ryan was the first to break the silence, his voice low and shaking. What the hell just happened, Emma? What did you mean, bought us time? Emma finally looked up, tears pooling in her eyes. It wasn't supposed to be real, she whispered. Years ago, I made a stupid deal. I didn't think it meant anything, but now it's come back. That thing, it came from my soul. I couldn't let it take me or you. So what? Jack snapped, his face pale with fury. You made another deal? You've just delayed whatever the hell that was. I didn't have a choice, Emma shot back, her voice breaking. It was going to take all of us if I didn't do something. Claire stepped forward, her face etched with pain. And now what? What happens at the end of this year? Emma hesitated, the words catching in her throat. I have to bring it another soul. The room erupted in chaos. Jack slammed his fist against the wall, cursing under his breath. Ryan sat down heavily, running his hands through his hair in disbelief. Claire simply stared at Emma, tears streaming down her face. So, you're supposed to hand someone else over to that thing? Ryan asked, his voice dripping with disbelief. How do you even— No, Emma, you can't do this. I know, Emma cried. I know I can't, but I'll figure something out. There has to be another way. What other way? Jack demanded. You think it's just going to let you off the hook? You think you can negotiate your way out of this? Claire stepped closer, her voice trembling but steady. Emma, listen to me. We're your friends, but this is beyond anything we can handle. We need help. Real help. Emma shook her head, panic setting in. Who would believe us? Who could even do anything about this? This isn't something we can just call the cops for, Claire. Jack leaned against the wall, his voice quieter now, but no less angry. So, what's the plan, Emma? Are you going to let this thing take you? Or worse, are you actually considering giving it someone else? The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She couldn't answer because she didn't know. Her mind was a whirlpool of guilt, fear, and desperation. She had 1 year to find a solution, but every possible answer seemed impossible or monstrous. I don't know, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I need time to think. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Midnight had passed, but its chime still seemed to echo in Emma's ears, a grim reminder of the promise she had made. I'll fix this, she said finally, her voice trembling with determination. I don't know how, but I will. I won't let any of us pay the price. Her friends exchanged wary glances, but no one said a word. The fire crackled, its warmth unable to dispel the icy tension in the room. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in silence. But Emma knew that the clock was ticking, and her year had already begun. The small town of Brightridge was buzzing with excitement as New Year's Eve approached. Every year, the entire town gathered in the square to witness the midnight countdown at the old clock tower. Unlike ordinary clocks, Brightridge's ancient timepiece was said to chime 13 times at midnight, a peculiar tradition that had earned the town both fame and a touch of superstition. Maggie had heard the stories all her life. Her parents always spoke of the clock with a mix of reverence and unease, cautioning her never to stay in the square past the 13th chime. But Maggie was skeptical of the legends. At 17, she was more interested in capturing the perfect photo of the celebration for her social media feed than worrying about old wives' tales. Maggie, you coming or what? Her best friend Theo called from the doorway of her house. Yeah, just a sec, she said, slipping her phone into her pocket and grabbing her coat. The snow crunched under their boots as they walked to the town square, the streets lined with glowing lanterns and festive decorations. The square was already packed with townsfolk, the air alive with laughter, music, and the hum of anticipation. Maggie spotted her younger sister Ellie, standing with a group of kids near the clock tower. Ellie's face was flushed with excitement, her bright red scarf standing out against the white snow. Ellie, Maggie called. Stay close, all right? Ellie waved back but didn't move, too engrossed in her friend's chatter. Maggie sighed and turned her attention back to Theo, who was balancing 2 steaming cups of cocoa. Here, he said, handing one to her. So, what's the plan? We just wait for the clock to do its creepy thing? Pretty much, Maggie said with a shrug. You're not freaked out by it, are you? Theo smirked. Not a chance. Though my grandma swears something weird happened during the countdown when she was a kid. She won't talk about it, though. Everyone in this town has a story about the clock, Maggie said. None of them ever make sense. As the hour inched closer to midnight, the crowd grew restless. The mayor climbed onto the small stage beneath the clock, tapping the microphone to get everyone's attention. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice carrying over the murmurs. Thank you for joining us for another year of celebration here in Brightridge. Let's ring in the new year with joy, hope, and gratitude. The crowd cheered, their voices echoing against the surrounding buildings. Maggie glanced at Ellie, who was now closer to the clock, her eyes fixed on its towering form. The hands of the clock crept toward midnight, and the town held its collective breath. Maggie's heart began to race, not with fear, but with anticipation. She raised her phone, ready to capture the moment. As the first chime rang out, deep and resonant, the crowd erupted in cheers. Maggie grinned, her phone snapping photo after photo. The second chime followed, then the third. The excitement grew with each passing note, but Maggie noticed something odd. Ellie was still staring at the clock, unmoving, her expression unusually serious. The 10th chime rang, then the 11th. The air grew colder, the cheers fading to murmurs as an unnatural stillness settled over the square. Maggie's hand trembled as she lowered her phone. The 12th chime sounded, louder and deeper than the rest, reverberating through Maggie's chest. She looked around, suddenly uneasy. And then the 13th chime began. The 13th chime was different. It wasn't just a sound, it was a sensation. The air seemed to vibrate, heavy and oppressive, as if the world itself held its breath. Maggie froze, her eyes fixed on the clock. The chime dragged on, deeper and more resonant, echoing unnaturally across the square. The festive atmosphere of the crowd was gone, replaced by an eerie silence. People looked around, confusion etched on their faces. Some whispered nervously, while others clutched their loved ones. Maggie's heart pounded. She turned to Theo, whose usual smirk was replaced by a look of unease. "Do you feel that?" she asked. "Yeah," he muttered. "This doesn't feel right." Her eyes darted to Ellie, who was still standing near the base of the clock. Unlike the others, Ellie didn't seem confused or scared. She was transfixed, her head tilted slightly as if listening to something no one else could hear. "Ellie!" Maggie shouted, but her voice felt muffled, swallowed by the thick, unnatural quiet. She pushed through the crowd, Theo trailing behind her, and reached her sister just as the final vibrations of the 13th chime faded into the cold night. "Ellie, what are you doing?" Maggie demanded, grabbing her sister's arm. Ellie didn't respond at first. Her wide eyes were locked on the clock's face, which seemed to shimmer faintly in the moonlight. Finally, she spoke, her voice distant and dreamlike. "It's calling." Maggie's stomach twisted. "What's calling? Ellie, snap out of it!" Ellie blinked and looked at her sister, her expression dazed. I don't know. It just feels like I need to stay." "No," Maggie said firmly, gripping her arm tighter. "We're leaving, now." Before Ellie could protest, a sudden gust of icy wind swept through the square, extinguishing the lanterns and plunging the crowd into darkness. Gasps and cries filled the air as people fumbled for their phones and flashlights. Maggie pulled her phone from her pocket and turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the blackness. She scanned the crowd, her chest tightening as the faces around her grew more panicked. "Maggie," Theo whispered, his voice shaking. "Look." She followed his gaze to the clock tower. The clock face, usually dull and weathered, was glowing faintly. Strange symbols flickered across its surface, appearing and disappearing in rapid succession. "What is that?" Maggie breathed, her grip on Ellie tightening. "I don't know," Theo said, "but I don't think it's good." As the glow intensified, the air grew colder. A low hum began to emanate from the clock, vibrating deep in Maggie's bones. The crowd started to back away, their fear palpable. Then, without warning, the ground beneath the clock began to crack. Thin, jagged fissures spread outward, glowing faintly with the same eerie light. Maggie's pulse raced as Ellie took a step toward the clock. "Ellie, stop!" Maggie yelled, pulling her back. "I can't," Ellie said, her voice trembling. "It's pulling me." Maggie turned to Theo, panic rising in her chest. "We have to get out of here." Before he could respond, a deafening sound filled the square, a deep guttural roar that seemed to come from the very earth itself. The crowd scattered, screams echoing through the night as the glowing fissures widened. Maggie looked back at the clock, her heart sinking. Something was emerging from the cracks. The fissures in the ground widened as the roaring intensified. From the glowing cracks emerged a dark, writhing substance, thick and tar-like, yet alive. It pulsed and churned, spreading across the ground with a malevolent purpose. Maggie stood frozen, gripping Ellie's arm as tightly as she could. Around them, the crowd was in chaos, people pushing and screaming as they fled from the square. Theo grabbed Maggie's shoulder, his face pale. "We need to move, now!" Ellie struggled against Maggie's grip, her small frame surprisingly strong. "Let me go!" she cried, her voice laced with desperation. "I have to go to it!" "No!" Maggie yelled, her voice cracking. "Ellie, what's wrong with you? Snap out of it!" The writhing substance began to take shape, forming spindly skeletal limbs that stretched unnaturally long as it pulled itself from the ground. Its head emerged last, featureless except for two hollow, glowing eyes that scanned the square. The creature's movements were jerky and disjointed, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. "What the hell is that?" Theo whispered, his voice barely audible over the commotion. Maggie didn't answer. She couldn't. Her eyes were locked on the creature as it turned toward the clock, its gaze fixed on the glowing face. For a moment, it seemed to ignore the terrified crowd, but then its head snapped toward them. The hollow eyes landed on Ellie, and the creature began to move. Its limbs stretched and contracted as it dragged itself forward, the ground beneath it hissing and steaming where the tar-like substance touched the snow. Maggie's blood ran cold. "Run," she said, her voice shaking. "Theo, take Ellie and run." "I'm not leaving you," Theo shouted. The creature let out another guttural roar, shaking the ground as it moved faster. Maggie shoved Ellie toward Theo. "Go, I'll catch up." Theo hesitated for a split second before grabbing Ellie and pulling her away. Ellie screamed and fought against him, her cries echoing in Maggie's ears as she turned back to face the creature. It was only feet away now, its towering form blocking out the light of the clock. Maggie's hands trembled as she fumbled for something, anything that could stop it. Her phone flashlight flickered as the creature reared back, one of its spindly limbs lashing out toward her. She ducked just in time, the limb slamming into the ground where she had been standing. The impact sent a shockwave through the square, knocking her off her feet. She scrambled backward, her heart pounding as the creature loomed over her. "Maggie!" Theo's voice rang out from the edge of the square. He had stopped, still holding Ellie, his face contorted with fear. The creature hesitated, its head tilting slightly as if hearing something. It turned away from Maggie, its glowing eyes focusing on Ellie once more. "No," Maggie whispered, her stomach twisting in horror. She forced herself to her feet, adrenaline surging through her veins. "Hey!" she shouted, waving her arms to draw its attention. "Leave her alone!" The creature paused, its head snapping back toward Maggie. For a moment, it simply stared, its eyes glowing brighter. Then it spoke. A deep guttural voice resonated through the square, though its mouth did not move. "The child is chosen." Maggie's heart stopped. "What do you mean, chosen?" The creature didn't answer. It turned back to Ellie, its movements deliberate and unstoppable. Maggie's mind raced. She couldn't let it take her sister. Grabbing a heavy piece of broken cobblestone from the ground, she ran toward the creature, her fear giving way to desperation. She had no plan, no idea how to stop it, but she had to try. Maggie sprinted toward the creature, gripping the cobblestone tightly in her trembling hands. Every instinct screamed for her to turn and run, but she couldn't abandon Ellie, not now, not ever. As she closed the distance, the creature turned its head, its hollow, glowing eyes locking onto her again. It reared back, one of its elongated limbs lashing toward her. Maggie ducked under the swipe and swung the cobblestone with all her strength. The jagged edge connected with the creature's leg, a sickening crack reverberating through the square. The creature let out a deafening roar, staggering slightly, but it didn't fall. Instead, it seemed to grow more enraged. Its tar-like body rippled and writhed as it turned fully toward Maggie. "Stay away from her!" Maggie screamed, swinging the cobblestone again. This time, the creature caught her arm mid-swing, its grip icy and crushing. Pain shot through her as the cobblestone fell from her grasp, clattering to the ground. "Maggie!" Theo shouted. He had let go of Ellie, who stood frozen, her face pale and blank. He ran toward Maggie, his own fear overridden by determination. "No, Theo! Stay back!" Maggie yelled, struggling against the creature's grip. But Theo didn't stop. He grabbed a metal pole from the debris littering the square and lunged at the creature, striking its back. The creature let out another guttural roar, releasing Maggie as it turned to face Theo. Maggie fell to the ground, gasping for air, her arm throbbing with pain. "Theo, no!" The creature's glowing eyes narrowed as it swiped at Theo, narrowly missing him as he dodged to the side. But its movements were too fast, too unnatural. Another limb lashed out, hitting Theo square in the chest and sending him flying into a snowbank. "Theo!" Maggie cried, crawling toward him. Ellie, meanwhile, stood motionless near the base of the clock tower, her eyes fixed on the creature. Her lips moved, but no sound came out, as if she were speaking to someone. Or something. Maggie turned to her sister, fear gripping her chest. "Ellie, run, please!" Ellie didn't move. Her small hands reached out toward the glowing fissures in the ground, her fingers trembling. "I have to go," she whispered, her voice distant and dreamlike. "No, you don't," Maggie screamed, pulling herself to her feet. She staggered toward Ellie, but the creature blocked her path, its towering form an impenetrable wall of darkness. Maggie scrambled to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her. The creature stood between her and Ellie, its dark form pulsing with energy as it loomed over the glowing fissures. The clock face spun faster, the strange symbols becoming a blur of light and shadow. The entire square seemed alive, as though the clock tower itself was breathing. "The clock!" Maggie shouted again, glancing at Theo, who was struggling to stand. "We have to stop it." Theo coughed, clutching his ribs as he staggered toward her. "Stop it? How? It's a freaking clock, Maggie." "I don't know," Maggie admitted, panic rising in her chest. "But this started when it chimed 13. Maybe if we stop it, we can break whatever this is." Ellie took another step toward the clock, her expression blank, her hands outstretched as if drawn by an invisible force. The creature remained motionless, watching her as though it were guarding her path. "No, Ellie!" Maggie screamed, dashing toward her sister. The creature moved to block her, its limbs stretching unnaturally long. Maggie skidded to a halt, narrowly avoiding its grasp. "Keep it distracted," Maggie yelled to Theo. "I'll figure out the clock." Theo hesitated for only a moment before grabbing the metal pole again and charging at the creature. "Hey, over here, you freak!" he shouted, swinging the pole with all his strength. The creature turned toward him, emitting a guttural growl as it lashed out. Theo dodged, the pole glancing off its tar-like body. It seemed more irritated than hurt, but his distraction gave Maggie the opening she needed. She sprinted toward the base of the clock tower, where the glowing fissures radiated an intense heat. The closer she got, the more oppressive the energy became, pressing against her chest like a physical weight. Her eyes darted upward to the clock face, the symbols spinning faster and faster. "How do I stop it?" she muttered to herself, scanning the tower for any kind of mechanism or weak point. Her gaze landed on a small access door near the base, partially hidden by a pile of rubble. She dropped to her knees, frantically clearing the debris. Her fingers burned against the glowing stones, but she didn't stop. Finally, she yanked the door open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling upward into the tower. "Maggie, hurry!" Theo shouted from behind her. She glanced back to see him narrowly avoiding another swipe from the creature. Ellie was still moving toward the clock, her movements slow but deliberate. Maggie didn't waste another second. She climbed into the tower and started up the staircase, her legs aching as she pushed herself upward. The air inside was thick and stale, and the vibrations from the clock grew louder with every step. When she reached the top, she found herself in a small chamber housing the clock's mechanism. Gears larger than her body spun furiously, their metallic grinding almost deafening. The glowing symbols from the clock face were etched into the gears, pulsing with the same unnatural light. Maggie scanned the room, her heart racing. She spotted a large lever near the center of the mechanism. It was rusted and covered in frost, as though it hadn't been touched in decades. "This has to be it," she whispered, gripping the lever with both hands. She pulled with all her strength, her muscles straining as the lever refused to budge. "Come on, come on." Outside, the creature roared, its guttural cry shaking the entire tower. Maggie glanced out a narrow window and saw the fissures spreading further across the square, glowing brighter. Theo was on the ground, the metal pole lying uselessly beside him. The creature was closing in on Ellie. "No!" Maggie screamed, her voice echoing in the chamber. She yanked on the lever again, her desperation fueling her strength. With a groan of protest, the lever finally moved. The gears ground to a halt, the symbols flickering and dimming. The vibrations stopped, and the unnatural hum that had filled the square fell silent. For a moment, everything was still. Maggie slumped against the frozen lever, her chest heaving as the silence engulfed the clock tower. She peered out of the narrow window again, her heart leaping with hope. The fissures in the square had stopped spreading, and the glowing tar-like substance that made up the creature seemed to tremble, as if weakened. Outside, Theo managed to push himself to his knees, his face pale but determined. Ellie, however, remained motionless, standing dangerously close to the largest fissure. Her eyes still glowed faintly, her lips moving as though speaking to someone Maggie couldn't hear. Maggie turned back to the gears. Though they had stopped, the symbols etched into them flickered faintly, like embers in a dying fire. She had slowed whatever nightmare was unfolding, but she hadn't ended it. Not yet. Below, the creature let out another guttural roar, its spindly limbs writhing in frustration. It turned its hollow gaze toward the clock tower, its glowing eyes narrowing. Then, to Maggie's horror, it began climbing. The creature moved with terrifying speed, its limbs stretching and anchoring onto the tower's stone surface. The clock tower groaned under its weight, shaking violently with each movement. "Maggie, it's coming for you!" Theo shouted, his voice hoarse. He staggered to his feet, but there was little he could do as the creature scaled the tower. Maggie's pulse raced. She had to act fast. Her eyes darted around the chamber, searching for anything else she could use to stop the creature for good. Her gaze landed on the massive central gear that connected the clock's mechanism to the tower's face. If she could damage it, she might be able to sever the connection entirely. Grabbing a rusted wrench from the floor, she wedged it between the gear's teeth and began pulling with all her might. The metal groaned, sparks flying as the gear resisted her efforts. The tower shook again, harder this time. Maggie looked out the window and saw the creature was nearly at the top. Its limbs stretched unnaturally long, anchoring onto the ledge of the chamber. "Maggie, hurry!" Theo yelled from below, his voice barely audible over the sound of the grinding metal. "I'm trying!" she screamed back, tears streaming down her face. Her hands bled from the effort, but she refused to give up. With one final pull, the wrench snapped the gear loose. The mechanism let out a deafening screech as the entire structure shuddered violently. The symbols on the clock face flickered, then dimmed entirely. The fissures in the square began to close, the glowing tar retreating into the ground. The air grew still, the unnatural energy dissipating. Maggie let out a sob of relief, but it was short-lived. The creature, now directly outside the chamber, emitted a low, guttural growl. Its hollow eyes glowed brighter, filled with rage. It pulled itself inside, its towering form filling the small space. Maggie backed away, her heart hammering in her chest. "You dare disrupt the cycle," the creature said, its voice echoing in the confined chamber. "You will pay." Maggie pressed herself against the wall, her mind racing. She glanced at the central mechanism, now damaged but still faintly glowing. Desperation clawed at her as the creature loomed closer. "Not today," she whispered, grabbing the wrench and hurling it at the remaining gears with all her strength. The impact sent the entire mechanism into chaos. Sparks flew as the remaining gears ground to a halt, their connections severed. The tower groaned, the ancient stone trembling as the damage spread. The creature let out a deafening roar, its form flickering like a dying flame. It reached for Maggie, but before it could touch her, the clock tower began to collapse. Maggie ran for the staircase, her body moving on pure adrenaline as the structure crumbled around her. Stone and debris rained down, the roar of the creature mingling with the sound of the collapsing tower. She reached the base just as the entire clock tower gave way, a massive cloud of dust and snow engulfing the square. The world seemed to hold its breath as the dust settled, the remnants of the clock tower lying in a jagged heap in the center of the square. Snow continued to fall, covering the ruins in a cold, quiet shroud. The air, once thick with unnatural energy, was now still and heavy with silence. Maggie lay sprawled on the ground, her body aching from the frantic escape. She coughed, her lungs burning as she pushed herself onto her elbows, her eyes scanning the scene around her. The glowing fissures had vanished, the ground once again solid and unbroken. The tar-like substance that had made up the creature was gone, leaving no trace of its existence. "Ellie!" Maggie croaked, her throat raw. She forced herself to her feet, staggering toward where she had last seen her sister. Ellie was lying near the base of the ruins, her small frame partially covered in snow. Maggie's heart lurched, and she dropped to her knees beside her. "Ellie, wake up, please!" Ellie's eyes fluttered open, their usual warm brown color restored. She blinked up at Maggie, confusion etched on her face. "Maggie, what happened?" Maggie let out a sob of relief, pulling her sister into a tight embrace. "You're okay, you're okay." Theo stumbled toward them, his face streaked with dirt and blood. He leaned on the metal pole for support, his breaths labored. "You did it," he said, his voice weak but filled with awe. Maggie looked at him, tears streaming down her face. "I don't even know what I did. I couldn't let it take her." Theo managed a faint smile. "Well, whatever you did, it worked." The three of them sat in the snow, their exhaustion overwhelming. Around them, the townspeople began to emerge from hiding, their faces pale and wide-eyed as they took in the destruction. Whispers spread through the crowd, questions and fears mingling with the relief that the nightmare had ended. The mayor approached cautiously, his usual confident demeanor replaced by unease. "What in God's name happened here?" Maggie shook her head. "I don't know. she said honestly. But it's over now. The mayor nodded slowly, though his expression remained troubled. That clock has been part of this town for centuries. We never really understood its power, or its curse. Maggie glanced at the ruins, her chest tightening. It's better this way. Whatever was tied to it, it's gone now. Ellie clung to Maggie, her small hands trembling. Maggie, I was so scared. It was inside my head. It wanted me to go with it. You're safe now, Maggie said, stroking her sister's hair. I promise. But deep down, she wasn't so sure. The creature's words echoed in her mind. The child is chosen. Over the following days, the town tried to return to normal, though the scars of the night remained. The square was cordoned off, the ruins of the clock tower left untouched. People whispered about what had happened, each telling their own version of the events. Maggie, Theo, and Ellie didn't speak of it again. They avoided the square, the memories too raw to confront. But Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that their ordeal wasn't truly over. One evening, as she tucked Ellie into bed, her sister looked up at her with wide, tearful eyes. Maggie, she whispered, what if it comes back? Maggie forced a smile, brushing Ellie's hair from her face. It won't, she said firmly. We stopped it. But as she left the room, closing the door softly behind her, she felt a chill run down her spine. In the silence of her own bedroom, she pulled out her phone and scrolled through the photos she had taken that night. The last photo, a blurry image of the clock as it struck the 13th chime, sent a shiver through her. Faintly in the glowing light of the clock face, she could see the outline of something dark and skeletal watching from the shadows. She deleted the photo and stared out her window at the snowy night. Somewhere, in the back of her mind, she knew the creature's final words hadn't been a threat. They had been a promise. The city skyline sparkled as the last night of the year descended. High above the bustling streets, in an exclusive high-rise apartment, the party of the year was already underway. The sound of laughter, clinking glasses, and thumping music filled the lavish penthouse as the city's elite celebrated with reckless abandon. Olivia adjusted her sequined dress in the mirror, her heart pounding with excitement. She had never been invited to one of Nolan Reed's infamous parties before. The real estate mogul was known for his eccentric gatherings, where only the crème de la crème of society were welcome. She had snagged her invitation through her co-worker Claire, who claimed Nolan's New Year's Eve parties were unlike anything else. This place is insane, Claire said, pulling Olivia toward the bar as they stepped into the main room. The penthouse was a sprawling maze of luxury, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering breathtaking views of the city. Chandeliers cast golden light over the marble floors, and every detail screamed opulence. Olivia smiled nervously as she accepted a glass of champagne. It's overwhelming, Claire grinned. That's the point. You only live once, right? As the night wore on, Olivia began to relax. She mingled with the other guests, laughing at their stories and soaking in the glamorous atmosphere. She even met Nolan himself, a charming, enigmatic man with a disarming smile. Welcome, he said, raising his glass to her. Here's to new beginnings. But as the clock approached midnight, Olivia began to notice something odd. Despite the party's size, she hadn't seen anyone leave. Even those who had clearly had too much to drink lingered, their movements sluggish but deliberate. She also noticed that Nolan never seemed to stay in one place for long, flitting from group to group like a shadow. Is it just me, Olivia whispered to Claire, or is there something off about this party? Claire laughed, her cheeks flushed from champagne. Relax, Liv, you're just nervous because you're not used to this crowd. Olivia forced a smile, but her unease didn't fade. As the countdown to midnight began, Nolan climbed onto a makeshift stage, his presence commanding immediate silence. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice smooth and confident. Thank you for joining me on this special night. As the clock strikes 12, let us toast to the future and to the memories we leave behind. The guests cheered, raising their glasses. Olivia joined in, though her stomach churned. There was something about Nolan's words that didn't sit right with her. The countdown began, the crowd chanting in unison, 10, 9, 8. Olivia glanced around the room, her unease growing with every passing second. The faces of the other guests seemed to blur, their features unnaturally smooth, their eyes glassy and unseeing. 7, 6, 5. She turned to Claire, but her friend's expression was vacant, her champagne glass trembling in her hand. "Claire?" Olivia whispered, panic rising in her chest. 4, 3. The lights flickered, and the air grew heavy, a strange hum filling the room. Olivia felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to leave. 2, 1. As the clock struck midnight, the room erupted in cheers. Confetti rained from the ceiling, shimmering gold and silver. But as it fell, Olivia realized with a jolt of horror that it wasn't confetti at all. It was ash. The room filled with laughter and applause, but Olivia froze, her champagne glass slipping from her hand and shattering on the marble floor. The ash continued to fall, coating the guests in a fine gray powder. No one else seemed to notice or care. They simply kept laughing, toasting, and dancing as if nothing was wrong. "Claire," Olivia whispered, shaking her friend's arm. "Look around. What's happening?" Claire turned to her slowly, her movements unnaturally stiff. Her eyes, which had sparkled with life just moments ago, were dull and lifeless. "It's fine, Liv. Just enjoy the party," she said in a flat, monotone voice. Olivia recoiled, her heart pounding. "This isn't right. We need to leave." Before Claire could respond, Olivia's phone buzzed in her clutch. She fumbled for it, desperate for a distraction, but what she saw made her blood run cold. A text message from an unknown number flashed on her screen. "You will die at 12:47 a.m. Her breath caught in her throat. She stared at the message, hoping it was some sick joke, but the weight of the words felt too real. The time on her phone read 12:01 a.m. She looked around the room, her paranoia growing. Were the other guests receiving messages too? She scanned the crowd, searching for any sign of alarm, but everyone seemed oblivious. Then she noticed something strange. Some of the guests were standing unnaturally still, their heads tilted as if listening to something only they could hear. Her phone buzzed again. Another text appeared. "Your death will be painless if you accept it." Her knees nearly buckled. She clutched her phone tightly, her fingers trembling as she tried to compose a response. "Who is this?" she typed frantically. "What's going on?" No reply. She glanced at Claire again, hoping to shake her friend out of her trance. But before she could speak, a cold, raspy voice spoke from behind her. "Do you feel it yet?" Olivia spun around to see Nolan standing there, his smile as unnervingly calm as before. His sharp suit was untouched by the falling ash, and his eyes glinted with something dark and ancient. "What's happening?" Olivia demanded, her voice cracking. "What are these messages?" Nolan tilted his head, studying her like a predator sizing up its prey. "It's the price of admission, my dear," he said, his tone casual. "You're not just here to celebrate the new year, you're here to see it end." "I don't understand," Olivia stammered. "And what are you talking about?" Nolan's smile widened. "Every soul in this room owes a debt, some for greed, others for vanity, lust, or pride. The details don't matter. What matters is tonight, the clock resets, and their debts are paid." Olivia shook her head, stepping back. "No, this is insane." "Is it?" Nolan asked, his voice low and smooth. "Look around. Do you think any of these people are innocent?" Olivia's phone buzzed again, pulling her attention away from Nolan. The message was even more chilling than the first. "You are not innocent either." She felt the blood drain from her face. Her thoughts raced back to the things she had done, the corners she had cut, the lies she had told to get ahead in her career. Could this thing know? "I didn't do anything," she whispered, more to herself than to Nolan. Nolan leaned in, his voice a whisper in her ear. "None of us are guiltless, but the question is, what are you willing to do to survive?" Olivia's heart pounded as Nolan's words echoed in her ears. The lavish party around her felt increasingly unreal, as if she were watching a scene from a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Guests swayed to the music, their laughter dissonant and hollow against the grim reality sinking in. She looked back at Claire, hoping for a trace of her usual spark, but her friend remained eerily still, her expression vacant. "Claire, please," Olivia pleaded, shaking her. "We need to leave." Claire turned to her, and for a fleeting moment, her face seemed to ripple, her features warping like a reflection in disturbed water. "There's no leaving," she said, her voice unnervingly flat. "It's already begun." Olivia stumbled back, clutching her phone like a lifeline. The next message arrived, as if on cue. "The first will fall at 12:20 a.m. She glanced at the time, 12:12 a.m. A wave of dread swept over her. The words felt like an inevitability, as though the message itself would bring the prediction to life. Desperately, she scanned the room for Theo, Claire's boyfriend, hoping he could help. She found him near the bar, sipping champagne with an unnerving calmness. "Theo!" she called, rushing to him. "We have to get out of here." Theo blinked at her, confused. "What are you talking about? It's just a party." "No, it's not!" Olivia snapped, gripping his arm. "Check your phone. Something's happening. People are acting weird." Theo hesitated, then pulled his phone from his pocket. His face paled as he read the screen. "What the hell?" he muttered, showing her the text. "You will die at 12:39 a.m. "I told you," Olivia said, her voice shaking. "This isn't normal." Before Theo could respond, a loud crash interrupted them. A champagne glass shattered on the marble floor, drawing everyone's attention to a man standing near the windows. His face was pale, his body trembling as he clutched his phone. "No," he muttered, his voice rising in panic. "No, this isn't real." The guests watched in silence as the man's phone slipped from his hands, clattering to the floor. He staggered backward, his breath coming in short gasps. And then he collapsed. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Olivia rushed forward instinctively, but Nolan stepped in her path, his expression calm and detached. "I wouldn't get too close," he said. "What's wrong with him?" Olivia demanded, her voice trembling. Nolan glanced at the man's lifeless body. His time was up. The room seemed to shift as Nolan's words sank in. The other guests began checking their phones, their faces twisted in fear and disbelief. One by one, Olivia heard murmurs of times, 12:27, 12:33, 12:41, each whispered with growing dread. Her own phone buzzed again. She hesitated, afraid of what she might see. Finally, she unlocked it. "Your time will come. Prepare." Her chest tightened as she turned to Nolan. "What is this? Who's doing this?" Nolan's smile never wavered. "Think of it as a reminder. Every debt must be paid." "And if I don't?" Olivia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nolan's eyes gleamed. "Then the house collects." He gestured around the room. "But you're welcome to try and escape. Some do. They never succeed." Another buzz from her phone. This time, the message was chillingly specific. "Your time, 12:47 a.m. Accept it or choose another to take your place." Her stomach churned as she read the words. "What does that mean?" she asked. But Nolan was already walking away, disappearing into the crowd. Olivia's hands trembled as she stared at her phone, rereading the message over and over. "Your time, 12:47 a.m. Accept it or choose another to take your place." Her breath caught in her throat. The implications of the message were horrifyingly clear. Whoever, or whatever, was orchestrating this nightmare wasn't just predicting their deaths. It was giving them a choice: die or condemn someone else. Around her, the mood of the party had shifted completely. The air was heavy with fear, the once lively chatter replaced by hushed whispers and panicked murmurs. Guests huddled in groups, clutching their phones and exchanging terrified glances. Olivia found Theo again near the bar, his expression grim. "You saw it too," he said, his voice low. "The part about choosing someone else." She nodded, her stomach twisting. "What does it mean? How can any of this be real?" Before Theo could respond, another commotion erupted in the room. A woman screamed, and all eyes turned to a middle-aged man clutching his chest. His face was a mask of agony, his body convulsing as he dropped to the floor. The guests backed away in horror, giving him a wide berth. "No!" the woman screamed again, presumably his wife. She knelt beside him, shaking him frantically. "Wake up! Please wake up!" But it was no use. The man's body stilled, his face frozen in a rictus of fear. The woman's phone buzzed, and she let out a wail of despair. She held the screen up for everyone to see. The text read, "Your time has been extended. Another has taken your place. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Olivia's heart pounded as she realized what had happened. The woman had chosen her husband to die in her stead. Theo leaned in closer, his voice barely a whisper. She chose him. That's what it means. That's insane, Olivia hissed, her voice trembling. No one would do that, would they? Theo didn't answer, but his silence spoke volumes. A new text buzzed on her phone, making Olivia flinch. She hesitated before looking, her stomach knotting in dread. The message was short and cruel. The house knows your heart. Theo stared at her, his face pale. "You're not seriously considering that, are you?" "No," Olivia said quickly, though her voice wavered. "But people are doing it. That woman, she chose her husband." "And look what happened to her," Theo shot back, gesturing to the crowd. "She's sitting in the corner, rocking back and forth like she's lost her mind. Liv, this isn't just about survival. Whatever this thing is, it's feeding off us." Olivia felt a lump rise in her throat. She glanced at the woman Theo mentioned, her glittering dress now dull, her hair disheveled as she muttered to herself. The sight made Olivia's stomach twist, but the buzzing of her phone reminded her of the stakes. Choose or be chosen. The words flashed across the screen like a taunt. Olivia clenched her fists, her mind racing. Could she really sacrifice someone else to save herself? Her thoughts turned to Claire, the friend who had brought her here, the one who now seemed like a hollow shell of herself. And Theo, the one person she trusted in this nightmare. Could she doom either of them? "Liv," Theo said, his voice breaking the silence. "If it comes to it, pick me." She stared at him, horrified. "What? Number, I can't do that." "You might not have a choice," he said, his voice low but steady. "You're stronger than I am. If one of us has to make it out of here, it should be you." "No," Olivia said firmly, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm not doing this. We'll find another way." Theo opened his mouth to argue, but a new commotion drew their attention. A man near the edge of the room was shouting, his voice laced with desperation. "You think I'm just going to sit here and die? No, I'll choose, Before he could finish, his body seized. He fell to the floor, his phone clattering beside him. The screen showed a single, chilling message. Too late. The room fell silent, save for the faint hum of the music still playing in the background. Olivia's phone buzzed again, and she felt the weight of the words before she even looked. 12:47 a.m. approaches. Make your decision. She turned to Theo, her heart pounding. "I won't do it," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't care what happens." Theo grabbed her shoulders, his eyes fierce. "Liv, listen to me. This thing is playing with us. If you won't pick, then we'll face it together. But you can't give in. Do you hear me?" Before she could respond, the lights flickered and the room grew colder. The clock struck 12:45 a.m., its chime echoing ominously through the penthouse. And then Nolan appeared, stepping onto the stage with his glass raised. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice calm and measured, "it seems our little game is nearing its climax." His eyes locked on Olivia, and a slow, chilling smile spread across his face. "Tell me, my dear, what will you choose?" Olivia's heart pounded as Nolan's gaze bore into her. His question echoed in her mind, pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't bear. Around her, the other guests seemed frozen, their faces pale and vacant as if waiting for the answer. "I won't choose," Olivia said, her voice trembling but firm. "I'm not playing your game." Nolan tilted his head, his smile widening. Defiance. It's always so entertaining. But tell me, Olivia, do you really believe you can escape fate? Theo stepped forward, placing himself between Olivia and Nolan. "She's not alone," he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "If you want her, you'll have to go through me." Nolan laughed softly, a sound that sent chills down Olivia's spine. How noble. But this isn't about courage or loyalty. It's about the balance. The lights flickered again, and the air grew colder. The ash that had blanketed the room began to swirl, forming ghostly shapes that flickered in and out of existence. The guests murmured nervously, their fear palpable. The clock struck 12:46 a.m., its chime loud and ominous. Olivia clutched Theo's arm, her pulse racing as the final minute approached. Her phone buzzed one last time. She hesitated, dreading what she would see, but her shaking hands moved on their own, unlocking the screen. "Your time is up. Choose, or let the house decide." She looked at Theo, tears streaming down her face. "I can't do it. I can't." He placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression filled with a mix of fear and resolve. "Then don't. We'll face this together." The room grew deathly silent as the clock's hands crept toward 12:47 a.m. Nolan raised his glass, his dark eyes gleaming. And now, the moment we've all been waiting for. The final chime began, resonating through the penthouse like a death knell. The ash swirled violently, forming a massive, shadowy figure that loomed over the room. Its hollow eyes burned with an unnatural light as it turned its gaze toward Olivia. The figure spoke, its voice deep and guttural, echoing in her mind. "The debt is unpaid. The house will decide." Olivia clutched Theo's arm tighter, bracing herself for whatever came next. The shadowy figure raised a hand, pointing directly at her. Her breath caught in her throat, and she closed her eyes, waiting for the end. But nothing happened. When she opened her eyes, the figure's hand had shifted, now pointing at someone else, Nolan. "What?" Nolan said, his calm demeanor finally cracking. "Number. This isn't how it works. I own this house." The shadowy figure tilted its head, its hollow eyes gleaming with a cold, inescapable judgment. "The house owns all," it intoned, "including you." Nolan's protests turned to screams as the figure enveloped him in its swirling darkness. The guests watched in stunned silence as he was consumed, his body dissolving into ash. The swirling mass collapsed into itself, leaving nothing behind but a faint, lingering chill. The lights flickered back to life, and the ash settled, covering the floor in a thin gray film. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the faint hum of the city below. Olivia looked at Theo, her chest heaving with relief and disbelief. "It chose him," she whispered. "Why did it choose him?" Theo shook his head, his expression dazed. "I don't know. Maybe he was the one who owed the biggest debt." Around them, the other guests began to stir, their faces showing a mix of confusion and relief. It was as if a spell had been broken, though no one dared to speak of what had just occurred. Olivia's phone buzzed one last time. The message was short and final. "The debt is paid. You are free for now." She stared at the screen, her heart heavy. For now. The words felt like a warning, a reminder that this nightmare might not be over. "Come on," Theo said, taking her hand. "Let's get out of here." She nodded, letting him lead her toward the elevator, which now worked as if nothing had happened. As they descended, the penthouse and its horrors faded away, but the memory of the night lingered. When they stepped outside, the city seemed unnaturally quiet, the air crisp and cold. Olivia glanced back at the high-rise, its windows dark and lifeless. She knew she would never return to that place. But as she and Theo walked into the night, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house and the debt would come calling again.